Good morning, everyone. We've got about 4 minutes before we'll get started. We encourage you to take advantage of the chat today, a perfect place to drop questions as well as comments. And we are recording today's session, so we look forward to being able to share that with others over time. Again, we'll get started in about 4 minutes. Good morning. We're going to give it just one more moment here to see if we have some other folks join us, and we will get started. Again, we are recording today's event, and we look forward to chatting with you soon. Good morning and welcome to our Actionable Ways to Create a Family-Friendly Workplace webinar. We are thrilled to have you join us today. I'm Ann Hutchison, President and CEO of the Fort Collins Area Chamber, and I'm so happy to have you join us. I'm extremely excited for this conversation and really look forward to hearing from our friends at EPIC as well as early childhood. Let's take a moment to make sure that we're all on the same page. Again, we'll ask you to stay on mute unless you have a question. We'd certainly invite you to use the chat. That's a wonderful place to share your thoughts, your ideas, and your questions. And again, we are recording today's session so that we can make that available to others over time. The Chamber has been a strong advocate for childcare solutions here in Northern Colorado. We know that talent is incredibly important to our economic success here. And we've been standing up with and for business over time, identifying that our current childcare structure, unfortunately, is a barrier to many people entering the workforce in an effective way. So we've been a champion, joining in on conversations with partners throughout Northern Colorado to begin to identify what are the opportunities for us, how do we bend the curve, how do we make sure that people that are a part of a family can be a part of a workforce. And we know that there's a balancing act that has to occur there. And we're so fortunate to have really thoughtful leaders throughout Northern Colorado that are driving this conversation and showcasing ways that we can do both. We can be business and we can be a family-friendly workplace. And I'm just so happy to have with us today our two presenters. We have Nicole Riehl, she's the president and CEO of EPIC Colorado. And we also have Christina Taylor, who's the CEO for the Early Childhood Council of Larimer County. I'm going to turn it over to Nicole. And again, welcome everyone. We're thrilled to have you here.
Great. Thank you so much for that awesome introduction, and really appreciate you having me here today. And excited to talk about this topic. So just a quick background of myself. Again, as you mentioned, Anne, I have the honor and privilege of serving as the president and CEO of Executives Partnering to Invest in Children here in Colorado, otherwise known as EPIC, and not to be confused with your EPIC Center in Fort Collins. I was a competitive swimmer for 15 years, so I actually spent a good portion of my life swimming at the EPIC pool up in Fort Collins. And so ironically, now I work for a different EPIC, but love to talk about the workforce and early childhood education. So if you want to progress to the next slide there, Julie, the one after that, please. Great. So a little bit about EPIC. We are a 12-year-old nonprofit organization here in Colorado, founded by business leaders and CEOs and business executives who felt like there needed to be an organization in Colorado that could really serve as the business community's voice in support of early childhood investments and family-friendly policies that, number one, help us create a great place for families to work, live, and play here in Colorado, attracting and retaining a great workforce today by investing in early childhood and children and families, but also building our own future pipeline and developing a great future workforce by investing in children's futures early, because our business leaders know that that is really where we get the best return on investment. And so, of course, we serve as the business community's nonpartisan voice for early childhood. We work on topics like infrastructure. We work on policy at the state capitol and sometimes even federally, and have a lobbyist that helps us do so. Our business leaders get very engaged sometimes in the policy work that happens here in Colorado. And again, really have that mindset towards how we grow our own great workforce here in Colorado and support families and attract families to our state. So next slide, we are going to talk about the economic imperatives of childcare a little bit first here. Make sure that we're level setting with regards to why this is important to Larimer County business leaders, why this is important to our state as a whole. So first off, I wanted to pull up this chart that shows labor force participation rate as a whole. So these are generally labor force working ages that are shown. And you can see here that Larimer County and Colorado in general are above the national average when it comes to the percentage of adults in the workforce who are working in the labor force. And there's a couple reasons for this. Of course, we know that people are attracted to Colorado because it's a great place to live, but also because it's a great place for them to put their careers and their skills to work. And so people often move here because they want to enter a specific industry. They want to work in the labor force. It's also generally a more expensive state to live in. We have a higher cost of living in Colorado than a lot of other states do. And so we also have a lot of families who just by nature of living in Colorado, need to make sure that they have all adults in the household working and participating in the labor force in order to afford their housing, in order to afford all of the different living expenses that come with living in a very popular and beautiful state like Colorado and beautiful communities like Fort Collins and Larimer County as well. So the next slide will also show you what we've seen with regards to our population growth here in Colorado, but also in Larimer County. You can see that Larimer County actually trends higher than Colorado's population growth, and Colorado as a state trends higher than the country by far. And in fact, this deck is a little bit outdated. When we look at the demographer's office information and data, we actually know that Larimer County in general and the Fort Collins area is still growing at a higher pace than the state of Colorado as a whole. And actually that trajectory has grown a little bit steeper. So again, you are a community that is attracting a lot of great talent. A lot of families are moving to your community. They're looking for jobs. They're looking for careers. But we also know that these young professionals, these families, these individuals moving to Larimer County and moving to Fort Collins also come with children. And so it's important that we make sure that the workforce, those people who are coming to your community to live a great life, to pursue a career, to put their skills to good use, also have an opportunity to make sure that their children are well cared for, educated, and have a place to be in their community locally. So the next slide, we're really going to point to this challenge that we've had in Colorado, and this has been a decade-long issue. This is not something that was brought on necessarily by the pandemic, although it's certainly been exacerbated by that. And I know my friend Christina is going to talk about that later. But in general, Colorado and communities like Fort Collins, Larimer County have seen this tremendous growth in population. We've seen job growth and in general industry growth and diversification across our industries in Colorado, which are all really great things. We still have a lot of inward migration here in Colorado, even throughout the pandemic. However, unfortunately, we've also seen a decrease in childcare access and a decrease in affordability for families. There are a lot of different pressures and really economic components that roll into that around the childcare access and affordability. But unfortunately, we've seen that downward trend across our state. So even as our population has grown by over 700,000 people here in Colorado, we've seen tens of thousands of childcare slots actually lost. Unfortunately. So next slide, we are also going to talk about some of the COVID impacts we've heard about with regards to employees in childcare. So a lot of this data is national data. Most of it is coming from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which did a really broad study across a number of chambers and with many businesses across the country. But we know that a lot of parents are really reporting that childcare has an adverse impact on their ability to select the jobs they want to select, stay in the workforce, participate in the workforce. So even before the pandemic, we knew that 79% of parents had reported that adverse impacts they had adverse impacts on their efforts or commitments at work due to childcare problems. And it's very likely that this percentage is drastically higher now that we've gone through the pandemic. And really anyone with a young child has probably experienced this. I have an 8-year-old myself. And so while she is now, of course, in 2nd grade, last year, I became a part-time 1st grade teacher while she was virtually learning and had the privilege of working from home remotely and having some flexibility to accommodate that, but it was still really, really hard. And my husband and I had to figure out how to balance all of that. Parents have definitely had a lot of challenges these past couple of years. And the Center for American Progress actually just released new data sheets yesterday on all of the states' progress around early childhood. And they estimate that we have almost 46,000 Colorado parents making career sacrifices due to issues with childcare. These are parents that maybe are underemployed in the workforce. Maybe they're not in the workforce at all. And these could potentially be employees that your companies, your community is really looking for. And then we also, of course, during these Chamber of Commerce studies saw that we had half of parents who hadn't returned to work because of childcare issues. Parents really unsure if they were going to continue their working situation. Employers reporting that they had seen employees leave for childcare reasons. 16% of employers were reporting that, almost a fifth. And of course, 11% of working parents turning down positions due to childcare as well. So this is really a system-wide impact. This is a national impact. It's not specific to one certain community, but we know that this is really happening across the board. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I have animation on this one. I always forget. Okay, so what we do know is that nationally, we have about 16% of our US workforce, just shy of 27 million people relying on childcare in order to work in the workforce. Colorado has a higher percentage of individuals within ideal working age. Our state's actually much higher in terms of that, and also a younger state in general. So we project that Colorado is actually closer to about 20% of our workforce relying on childcare in order to participate in the workforce and attend work. We also know that among those who have stopped looking for work, that childcare was twice as likely to be cited as a reason by women as opposed to men. So this is about 25% of women who had stopped looking for work, saying that childcare was the primary barrier and challenge for that. And then we also know that for many families, only about 39% of respondents to a survey that McKinsey and Company completed nationally that had household incomes below $50,000 and had children at home said that they could even afford that childcare that they needed. So again, some pretty stark statistics here with regards to what families need and what they're experiencing right now across the country. Next slide, please. Oh yeah. And these are just a few headlines that we've seen most recently in publications like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, other organizations like that. Certainly, this has come to the forefront as an issue that many business leaders are now aware of. You know, I just had a conversation with a CEO a couple of weeks ago, and I had spoken with him prior to the pandemic, and we had had a conversation about the work that Epic does around early childhood advocacy and you know, all the things that we engage our business leaders with. And he had told me before the pandemic, yeah, you know, it's not really a priority for our company. This isn't something that we really worry about. I don't even think it's an issue for our workforce. And then he actually circled back around with me just a couple of weeks ago and said, you know, I regret that we had that conversation before the pandemic, and I was just so blind to some of the challenges that our workforce really does have. But certainly now this has become a very big issue for our company and has been a big challenge, according to our HR department, around hiring. And we want to look at doing something with regards to childcare. So I think for many companies, this has been something that has been a real eye opener with respect to the pandemic and how these different components have really played out across the workforce, but also specifically as it relates to women. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to dive into some of this data as well that we've seen. So this is also from McKinsey and Company, a recent survey that they did with employees and asked them to rate their perceived negative impact of certain aspects of their identity when it comes to economic opportunity, both in terms of their job prospects, but also in terms of being fairly recognized and rewarded for work. And of course, you'll see here that these perceived negative impacts rise when we look at certain races and ethnicities. Certainly around sexual orientation, age is a big one. As people age, certainly their perceived opportunities also diminish in the workforce. But I also want to point out that they actually did break this down based on both men and women, but also around family obligations. And, women working in the workforce had, without children, had a 19% perceived negative impact, which was still higher than men, slightly, albeit not a huge difference. But you can see that when we add a child at home, that is a drastically different picture. In fact, it goes from 19% to 37% when a woman has a child, that they perceive a negative impact on their economic opportunity with regards to their job prospects and being fairly recognized and rewarded and promoted at work. And of course, that also does increase for men, but definitely not as much. We don't see that, that difference as much here. And the next slide is really going to look at some of the impacts that we have seen specifically on women in the workforce. So EPIC co-authored a report with the Common Sense Institute, which is a research and data organization here in Colorado, in early 2021, to really look into this in depth, because unfortunately, we are now at the lowest female workforce participation rate since 1988. We have lost decades and decades of progress when it comes to women working in the workforce. And we really need women in the workforce. Some of you may have seen recent articles related to comments that Elon Musk made around people aren't having enough children, that our population is not growing at the rate that we need it to. And that is definitely true to some extent. In order for our industries to grow at the rate that we know they can grow at, in order for the US to become and remain a global leader when it comes to economic development and business and all these different industries that are growing and thriving, we definitely need women in the workforce. That is an imperative to make sure that our communities, our country, our states can remain leaders and continue to grow. But you'll see here, of course, that we've lost a lot of women from the workforce, and certainly that has been much more drastic as it relates to women with children. So men have really kind of bounced back, so to speak, and recovered those workforce losses relatively quickly throughout the pandemic, but we continued to see very drastic reductions in the female workforce participation rate. Oh yes, and LFPR is the labor force participation rate. Thank you for that question. Gotta love acronyms in every industry, including labor. So yes, this will show you really what we've seen. And we certainly have seen women slowly coming back to the workforce. We've seen that return a bit. We also know that some of the hardest hit industries through the pandemic, industries like entertainment, tourism, hospitality, different things like that were also heavily represented by women, but also sustained greater losses proportionally with respect to women in their own workforces as well. So, this is just kind of at the point in time when this was looked at, we had over 100,000 women missing from our labor force here in Colorado. So as companies are thinking about how do we get people hired, how do we attract people back into our workforce, a very large proportion of those missing people are still women. Next slide, please. This also shows you just some trends that we've seen between countries with respect to women in the workforce. So this is actually a graph that was just released by the Fed. And they have been tracking women's workforce participation rates across all of the economic development, kind of the core economic development leading countries. And so you can see here that countries like France and Canada, even the United Kingdom, and certainly Japan have made great growth in terms of women in the workforce and have been able to sustain that growth. But you can see that really up until 1995, the US was on track to remain in that growth pattern with other countries. And then we slowly started to really falter and kind of flatline a little bit with regards to female workforce participation rate in comparison to other countries. Coincidentally, these are also other countries that do invest a great deal of funding and support into access to childcare. And so in many cases, when you have a child in these countries, if you want to remain or enter in the workforce, you actually do have access to very low cost or sometimes free childcare if that's something that you want to pursue. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to bring this local, and then I'm going to let Christina dive into some of the local data around COVID impacts in childcare. So I always like to bring this as local as possible when it comes to economic impacts of childcare shortages. And so this is the data source here is the Council for a Strong America. They did a Ready Nation report just as the pandemic was hitting with regards to what the economic impact on Colorado was as a result of not having sufficient access to childcare for the workforce. So this is pre-pandemic. This is not taking into account the losses and the impacts that we've seen as a result of the pandemic. But Larimer County is approximately 4.5% of our state's GDP. So this report estimated that we had a $2.2 billion lost earnings, productivity, and revenue impact for Colorado as a result of this issue, which really boils down to about $99 million in economic impact for Larimer County. If we bring that down to the employer level, it was $680 million for employers lost here in Colorado. And for employers specifically in Larimer County, that's about $31 million. And if we bring this down even closer around jobs, if we really kind of use the placeholder that a lot of economic development organizations use around the annual contribution to the economy of a job, this also means that the local Larimer County community has an opportunity cost of about 900 jobs every single year as a result of not having sufficient access to childcare for the workforce. So these are jobs that could exist in local businesses in Fort Collins and Larimer County that don't. And this is economic growth and value that could exist in your community right now that doesn't exist because of this issue around childcare. So I am going to pass it on to Christina, and she's going to talk about some of the local data and access information there.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Taylor, the CEO of the Early Childhood Council of Larimer County. Very quick background on us. We are a statutorily defined organization to support the early childhood sector in local communities. So there are 34 of us throughout the state, and we work very hard to support all things early childhood in our communities. Next slide, Julie. So to kind of tag on to what Nicole was sharing, I wanted to talk a little bit about what it looks like locally for us. The average cost of care in Larimer County for families is about $12,000 a year for childcare for one child, often all the way up to $20,000 for an infant. Currently and in the past, so while the pandemic has exacerbated childcare access, we've had an access issue for decades. So currently there's about a 40% shortage in childcare access for families with preschoolers in Larimer County, meaning 40% of families that are working and need care cannot find it. And then 75% for those with infants and toddlers. That's incredible. That means 75% of families with new babies at home cannot go to work, either one or both parents, because they cannot find childcare. So that impact on employers and your ability to attract and retain really high qualified employees is stark. Lastly, about 30% of a family's income, based on the average median household income, is spent on childcare for a family of 4 with 2 kids under the age of 5. So almost 40% of someone's income is spent on childcare. Next slide, please. So a lot of folks don't necessarily understand why we care about early childhood, right? This first 5 years, a lot of folks are, it's babysitting, those kiddos just need somewhere to be, someone to keep an eye on them. But really we know that the first 5 years of a child's life is the most crucial. A child's brain develops at a pace that's unmatched at any other point in life. They form about a million new neural connections every minute in the first few years of life. Those neural connections are formed based on their interactions with caregivers. from whether it be parents, grandparents, or the early educators, such as childcare providers. They are the basis for that early growth. And we know that a child that is able to access that early care and education is better prepared for kindergarten. They read earlier, they'll be more likely to graduate high school and attend college, earn a higher wage, and live a healthier life. Next slide, please. All of that really equals less cost for our community in a variety of ways. So it decreases healthcare costs, it decreases unemployment costs, decreased crime rates, increased lifetime earnings. It really is an economic issue for our long-term success and for the future of our workforce, that these children have access to that 0 to 5 care and education. Next slide. Locally, and I know this data or this study feels old, but honestly, every time we redo this data, it rings true consistently, even since 2008. So United Way and the Coloradan here locally conducted a community-wide assessment back in 2008 on poverty in Larimer County and determined that the absence of affordable childcare was the single greatest deterrent to a family's self-sufficiency locally. So families spending so much of their income on childcare means they're not investing into our local economy in other ways, nor are they able to contribute to the workforce the way we want them to. Next slide. I often have conversations with business leaders in particular about why childcare, one, there's not enough of it, and two, why it's so expensive. And I think a lot of folks don't necessarily understand the state of this market, but it really is considered a market failure in that we count on parents to pay for the bulk of the cost of childcare, yet the cost to provide high quality care far exceeds what parents can afford. As I mentioned 2 slides ago, a family spends about $16,000 a year on preschool care and almost $20,000 a year on infant toddler care. I really like this quote from our current Treasury Secretary, and that it's time we treat childcare as what it is, an element whose contribution to economic growth is as essential as infrastructure or energy. The Federal Department of Health and Human Services did a study probably a decade ago and is still leaning heavily on that study, that the percentage of a family's income that is really reasonable to spend on childcare is 7%. And if you remember, again, a couple slides ago, currently in Larimer County, families spend about 37% of their income on childcare. Most families are paying between 13 and 30, depending on their annual income and the number of children, and of course, another wide variety of other factors. In terms of why it's a market failure, it's important to recognize that in order to increase the quality, increase the number of educators, and have the right amount of spots, providers would have to charge more to parents, and parents simply cannot afford more. So there's such a shortage, and childcare access continues to be such an issue because of the workforce. Early educators make an average of $13 to $15 an hour, which is not enough to even afford basic housing in Larimer County. I just did a deep dive into MIT's self-sufficiency wage study for here in Larimer County. And for instance, a parent with two parents with two children in the workforce, each need to make about $25 an hour to be able to live in Larimer County and afford basic needs. So childcare providers, often mothers, women, are making so far below that we are losing providers consistently. Obviously, the pandemic has exacerbated that in a huge way because the impact on early educators in particular has been extreme. They are dealing with, pandemic level precautions. They're dealing with lack of flexibility in their work schedules because there are so many children that need care. They're struggling to pay their most basic bills or even get their children to the doctor, all while making $13 to $15 an hour. Childcare centers can't afford to pay them more because if they did, that would increase the rate the families pay. I think there's a misperception out there that a center director perhaps is raking in the dough and the rest of the staff is really suffering as a part of that. And that's just not how it works. All the way up to the director and owner level, it continues to be a failed market in that you just can't afford to pay providers more, and we keep having this access issue. Next slide. Oh, it's all you, Nicole.
All right. So I know we've gone through a lot of data. I think some of it has probably been shocking to participants on this webinar, and to some extent is definitely very disheartening when it comes to thinking about the local community and what can be done. But the great news is that there's actually a lot that business leaders and employers can do to really help us solve these challenges and be a voice for change, because business leaders are very influential at the Capitol, locally, in lots of different places. It's one of the reasons why EPIC does exist, because it's a different type of interaction and message when we are advocating with legislators or we're talking to people about the importance of this, and we really come at it from the business bottom line and economic development perspective. So next slide, please. This is kind of a nice visual to show you that there's a spectrum of actions that employers can take and invest in to really help create solutions towards these challenges in your local communities. And this goes for small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and large businesses as well. So there are some kind of culture shifts and what I call quick wins. There are internal investments that can be made, and then there are larger community investments that can be made as well. So we're going to talk through this spectrum. And, what I always encourage business leaders to think about is, what are the feasible steps that you and your leadership team can commit to in the near future? And what are maybe some longer term goals that you'd like to look at in terms of getting engaged in or budgeting and planning for in the long term? But happy to say we have a lot of employers now really stepping up, getting interested in these types of solutions and actually taking action in Colorado. So the first slide we're going to review is really around our culture and quick wins. Julie, oh, there you go. So of course, everyone has probably heard the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it is so true. It's never been more true than right now, as we are in this pandemic and we have seen, this great resignation and this great kind of what I would call reevaluation by employees of what it is they're looking for, both in terms of value for their jobs, but also in terms of what they're looking for as with their employers, and that balance they're oftentimes looking for. So what we know is that through U.S. Chamber of Commerce surveys and work that's been done with employers across our country, oftentimes we hear employers say, oh yeah, we know what the challenges are. We hear about it through the grapevine, through human resources, or we hear about it through managers and middle management in our company. So we know that childcare is a problem. But what we do know is that only 13% of US companies on average actually conduct any sort of formal feedback and collect data from their employees around caregiving challenges and issues they might have with childcare, right? And this isn't always just specific to young children. We also have a lot of adults that are in that sandwich generation where they have older adults they're caring for and younger children that they're trying to care for as well. So number one, ask for feedback and collect data and make sure it is in an anonymous, formalized fashion, because oftentimes there's a lot of information and feedback that isn't coming through supervisors because people are really fearful sometimes of sharing that information with their direct supervisors. So making sure you have that formalized and you're continuing to really keep a pulse on what those needs are for your workforce. Second, check your training and your norms within your organization, your culture. So I see this all the time when we're talking with business leaders and doing some of our family-friendly consulting work, where we've got leadership in the organization that is very supportive of family-friendly approaches. They want their managers and their team members to accommodate employee needs and be flexible, and yet the trainings that are given to these managers or supervisors don't include information around that, and specifically provide very clear expectations and guardrails around how that is implemented consistently in the organization, and really kind of setting norms and expectations across the board for all staff. We also know that normalizing the challenges of working families is really important, and it's important for this to be done at all levels of the organization, including the very highest tiers of leadership. And I think that this is one that has been done very well throughout the pandemic, really out of necessity, right? So now we've had CEOs who have been doing, all hands calls on Zoom, and they've had their 4-year-old bust into their office behind them, or they've had their dogs jumping on the desk, right? Or whatever it might be. And so oftentimes this has just happened by nature of how we've had to change our work styles and what has happened throughout the pandemic. But it's important to remember that people and employees throughout an organization will take their cues from leadership and will see that, oh, if our CEO says, yeah, you know, I've got 2 kids of my own. Sometimes I'm shuffling around and we're, you know, managing pickups and drop-offs, or, you know, my kid's sick or whatever happens. And that's just part of life. And we want to accommodate that. But those things are really important to set a standard and a precedence for internally. Again, make sure you have consistency across supervisors and annual reviews. Another really important thing, we hear this from a lot of employees of, yeah, the company says they're flexible, but I know that my boss like really hates it when I ask to leave early to pick up my kid because, you know, the base program's closed on this certain day and I have to run out and do a 3 p.m. or 3:30 p.m. pickup. And you know, they really don't like that. They say it's okay, but I can tell they don't like it. And when it comes to my annual review, you know, there's no way for me to know that that's not going to hit me on my annual review. And so chances are they're just not going to take advantage of those family-friendly offerings because they feel like, you know, it's going to come through when it comes to annual reviews, and it's going to impact their long-term promotions and their long-term pay escalations that they'd like to have in the company. Again, flexibility, job sharing, and split shifts. This can look differently across organizations and types of industries. And so perhaps easier to do if you've got a banking institution versus a manufacturing facility that has, you know, 12-hour shifts. But we've definitely seen companies looking at this very specifically as it relates to their workforce and their operations and how they might be able to talk to their employees about what types of solutions could potentially work. You know, that you work a shift maybe for a certain portion of the day, have someone else come in and then come back and cover it. And so these are different things that we know companies have done. And also think about interviewing and potential candidate accommodations. So also know that there are potentially people out there who would love to work for your company. They might also have childcare challenges, especially if they're a single parent, and actually just getting to an interview or attending, you know, sometimes companies have, you know, 2-3 different interviews that have to be completed in order to be hired. And that can be really challenging if you're a single parent with children and you've got childcare needs, but no money to pay for childcare. So just think about those types of accommodations as well as you're thinking about really trying to attract the talent and hire the talent that you need for your operations. All right, next slide, we're going to talk about internal investments. So of course, you can look at ways to invest and expand in your family-friendly HR benefits. This could include things like helping families find childcare, thinking about backup childcare solutions, dependent care savings accounts, which do offer a payroll tax savings for employers. Paid family leave, of course, and bringing non-mobile infants to work. I've actually seen a lot more employers implement that as a strategy to say, you know what, when you come back from maternity leave, you know, we're happy to have the non-mobile infants, you know, come into the office if that office environment is appropriate for it. Obviously, there are some that aren't, but that could be a potential solution to look at. And of course, we know Colorado is implementing paid family leave in 2023. And so that's just going to be a whole other thing to think about, of course, for employers as that's implemented. Thinking about local community discounts, preferential access, and subsidies. So working with your local early childhood council and or childcare providers, especially if you have some near your operations where you think they could be partners in this work, you could certainly sit down and have conversations with them around those types of arrangements. This is especially true if you have maybe longer shifts or evening and weekend care needs that maybe just aren't being met in your local community. And then thinking about things like on-site or near-site childcare. So this has really come into play as employers are thinking now about convenience, productivity, and post-pandemic workplace design. Of course, we know that a lot of workers, if it's feasible, would prefer to work from home now, at least a couple days a week. I have had a lot of conversations with landlords to talk about putting childcare in as an amenity that could help attract and retain their own tenants, their own companies that could have offices there, but also are looking at childcare as a nice benefit. And even drop-in childcare is something that could help attract workforce for people who might have childcare on days that they're working from home, but would like to bring their child and drop them in on days that they come to the office. We do have a brand new employer-based childcare design lab and grant program here in Colorado. It's an $8.8 million grant program with another $5 million proposed in the governor's budget to continue funding that grant program in an ongoing way. EPIC is actually facilitating the design lab right now with 10 different projects, employer projects across the state. So we have a range of private, nonprofit, and governmental employers that are participating in that effort. And I know that there are several employers in Larimer County looking at this grant program as well. And I also just like to point out that there's a lot of risk myth busting to be done around this for the employer's perspective. We're doing a lot of partnership work with groups of employers that are trying to think about how they work on this and create this benefit in their community together to both create a governance entity that helps them mitigate the risk, but also cost share for this business model, because there is an investment that needs to be made. But of course, it makes that investment less difficult for employers to afford if you've got 4 or 5 employers involved versus one employer taking on all of that investment. And then, of course, there's a return on investment in this type of work as well, both in the form of tax credits, federal and state tax credits that come to the employers, but also in terms of employee engagement and retention. So a lot of employers, you may or may not track this information, but typically employers do have a high attrition rate when women have babies. A lot of women end up leaving the workforce, and we've definitely seen employers change those statistics pretty drastically with offering childcare. And then I know that Christina is going to talk about these pieces a little bit more, but there's a way for you as an employer to get involved in a larger community level and advocate for these types of investments. Keep in mind that this is really a conversation oftentimes in human resources that happens where people say, oh, you know, I can't access childcare. This isn't fair to me for you to offer this as a benefit. I want doggy daycare, or I want another, you know, stipend to offset this benefit that I can't take advantage of. Childcare is not an equal benefit. It is an equitable benefit. And the important thing to keep in mind is really that the workforce, the employees that companies are so desperately trying to hire right now, oftentimes have barriers like childcare in the way in order for them to participate in the workforce. So the employees that you mostly want to attract, hire, promote, retain, all of those things, childcare is probably a very important benefits piece to helping them be successful and helping you as an employer be successful in attracting those people. You can work with your local chambers, your partners like the Early Childhood Council and certainly EPIC to advocate for these things on the statewide and even federal level. EPIC does retain a lobbyist, and we work very closely with business leaders to advocate for these things and think through solutions from a private sector lens. Put your assets to good use, including real estate. Land and facilities are very expensive now in Colorado. So if you even have a building or real estate that you think could be offered up for your community and could be put to good use for childcare, that could be a really great way to help your local community. And then, of course, invest in community efforts to increase access to quality, affordable childcare for the workforce as a whole. So now I'm going to pass it on to Christina, and she's going to talk about what that might look like in Larimer County and Fort Collins.
Thanks, Nicole. And I will say, I love the highlight of local real estate solutions that could be used. That's happened here in Larimer County from government partners and from business partners before. You know, Boys and Girls Club often operates in donated land or buildings. Our organization and a child care center on our lower level are operating in a government building where we don't pay rent. And that's an incredible way to help increase the ability to provide care and reduce costs for those centers that are already overburdened with costs. So I like that. And the other thing I wanted to share before I move into some local solutions is that as an employer myself with 20 plus staff, all of whom are women in their childbearing age for obvious reasons. It's a caring profession, often women of childbearing age. We've learned a lot in the last year in terms of what it takes to retain our staff and ensure that we keep the incredible amount of expertise and experience we have. And we've taken a lot of steps to implement a lot of what Nicole has shared. So really offering a flexible work environment. We have a 6-month babies at work policy. You can bring your non-mobile infant all the way up to 6 months to the office. And then, allowing folks to have families. Really, I think Nicole mentioned the normalization of all of us as parents and professionals at the same time has been incredible over the last 2 years, but really requires consistent reinforcement when it comes to culture change. That's one thing I've learned within our own organization is that you can say all you want that you have a flexible environment, but if you're not modeling that and reinforcing it verbally and consistently, you're really not going to be having an impact with your staff because it seems too good to be true. So just wanted to highlight some of our local or our own experience as an organization. I can tell you that we have not lost a single staff member in 2 years. No, knock on wood, but that says a lot for an organization that's taken huge steps to support employee flexibility. In fact, we have 2 new infants among our staff. So just bragging a little bit, but these family-friendly practices really do play a role in retention. We'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what's out there for families to afford or to help them afford childcare. I think it's important as an employer to kind of have your mind wrapped around that. It's great for referring employees that might need additional support. So here's kind of a list of what exists right now in terms of helping families that can't afford childcare. I won't go into them too much. We partner with United Way, for instance, to distribute a childcare fund. They bring in about $500,000 a year to provide childcare scholarships. The Colorado Child Care Assistance Plan, or CCAP, expends about $5.5 million to $6 million locally every year in subsidizing childcare access. There are several nonprofit centers in town that offer sliding scales and reduced fees for families with lower income. And then some of our governmental programs like Colorado Preschool Program, Head Start, and coming soon Universal Pre-K offer free or very low cost care for families that need it. Next slide, please. We've taken lots of steps in the last 2 years locally to support childcare access and to support the infrastructure of childcare. One of the biggest steps we took right in the thick of the first year of our pandemic was launching Larimer Childcare Connect. And we're very proud of this because it's a technology-driven solution that allows families to access real-time supply and demand. So they can get into this portal, search for care based on their commute, where they live, and find real-time information on providers that have care and openings for them, which saves an enormous amount of time for families. Prior to this existing in Larimer County, families had to call around, and you call 40 centers in a day and none of them have an opening. That's a lot of time that you're spending trying to figure out where you can take your kiddo. So really proud of this solution. The other side of this is that through the pandemic, childcare providers have been kind of flipped on their head in terms of they're so used to operating with extensive wait lists. And for the first year of the pandemic, many of our providers weren't able to fill their spots because families were keeping their kids home. And providers don't necessarily know how to advertise always, right? Because they don't normally have to. Their care is an easily marketable public good. And so this portal that we launched really allowed providers to have a space to market their openings and ensure that they were filling them quickly, just to ensure that their ongoing revenue stream was maintained. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard that the state and federal government has invested quite a bit in that as well in terms of sustainability grants, which has been incredible, but short term. So Larimer Childcare Connect also will be offering the United Way Scholarship Fund, so families that need care can access and apply for it through Larimer Childcare Connect starting next year. And we hope to continue leveraging this tech solution as Universal Pre-K rolls out and as additional information comes down from the federal government. So excited about this resource. One thing I can say is that this is a great thing for employers to share with your staff. If you have families that are looking for care, referring them to this portal, it's free, and it will always be free as a way for families to access care is really important. In terms of other solutions, I'll talk a little bit about some of the federal solutions that are underway, although, you know, we can't always rely on the feds to get it done. And then a little bit of discussion on kind of what we've done locally and long-term solutions. So next slide. So one of the biggest topics of discussion right now is Biden's Build Back Better proposal. In that proposal, there's a universal preschool for all 3 to 4-year-olds and expanding childcare access for low and middle income families. It proposes to cap spending on childcare at 7% of annual income, which would be incredible both for, you know, economic investment in our community, but for families just to be able to afford childcare and work as well. This bill passed the House last month, I believe, and is in the hands of the Senate now. There is bipartisan support for the childcare portions of this proposal. There's some hope at the federal level, but it remains to be seen kind of what will be sliced and diced by the Senate before this bill passes. But this could be an incredible investment in terms of supporting access in our community and across the country. Next slide. Another big push that we've led locally over the last year has been a deep dive into what potential local sustainable funding streams might exist for us to support what is, you know, continues to be a market failure. So we engaged in a policy research process with some very qualified consultants from the Denver area that work on state level initiatives quite frequently as well, and really dug into what it might look like to subsidize childcare as a public good here locally. We did a really deep dive into research and successful models, both locally and across the country. Telluride in San Miguel County has a local tax that funds childcare. Aspen Summit County also has one to support their residents. Breckenridge, and then Multnomah County, Oregon, for instance, just passed about a year ago a ballot initiative that will fund universal access to childcare through tax dollars. We did local polling and cost modeling as well. So we hired Strategies 360, which is a national polling firm, and did polling locally to determine whether or not there was political viability for a tax initiative. And we're pleasantly surprised by the outcome of that we have voter appetite in Larimer County to support childcare access through some sort of tax, and considered 3 different sales tax or types of tax, through that public polling, and really heard from our voters that property tax is a hard no, just given the cost of living in Larimer County and the increasing cost of housing. Property tax was just not viable, but sales tax was something that our community was amenable to. And taxes on marijuana and cigarettes didn't arise as something that was feasible or would generate enough revenue, just given the existing taxes on those items. Next slide. So you don't have to read all this, please don't. But you can actually skip to the next slide, Julie. So we proposed a ballot initiative that we consider placing on this year's ballot. Now, I'm sure all of you have already voted and you saw that it wasn't on there. But based on the research and the information we did, we had proposed a 0.25% sales tax or 25 cents on a $100 purchase, which would generate an estimated $17 million a year locally. We specified that the revenue generated by that tax would be used for 4 main purposes. The majority of which would be the first 2, which is subsidizing the cost of care for families with children birth to age 5, and then investing in the early childhood system to expand capacity and improve quality. That's really the workforce issue, the fact that we cannot retain staff in the field. For instance, we just talked to a center about 2 days ago that told us her what's the word I'm looking for? Her turnover rate in her staff was almost 100% over the last year. And so increased investments in the early childhood workforce through salary subsidies to get those wages up, et cetera, was a big part of this. And then, of course, much smaller buckets would be to cover evaluation of the program and to pay for administration with the reasonable cap in place. Next slide, please. This kind of just gives you a little bit more information on what we had planned to fund with that, including workforce and human capital, physical capital, investments in families for tuition support, et cetera. Next slide. We proposed that it include a 20-year sunset, that the Early Childhood Council be the nonprofit lead based on our expertise and standing in the community. Next slide. Sorry, a lot of this goes into a little more detail than you all care about. What we ultimately chose not to move forward with the ballot initiative this year. We had pushed it forward pretty quickly, just given the political viability of it in 2021 and the very small ballot, but really ultimately decided we needed more time. And so we haven't determined exactly what year we'll be considering this, but this is a proposal that continues to be top of mind for the Early Childhood Council and for many of our partners in the community, businesses, governments alike. We're hopeful to find a solution similar to this in the coming year or two. And as we really know, and as many other communities have demonstrated, this is one of the only ways that we can really fix this issue. We can fix the access issue. We can ensure that providers, early educators are paid a living wage and that we can retain them, and ultimately can assure that all of your employees are able to access childcare and make it to work. Next slide. So as I said, we will be communicating more as we go forward in terms of kind of what local subsidization might need to look like, what that policy might need to look like, and how folks can get involved. There's opportunities to donate funding to current subsidy pools like the United Way Scholarship Fund or the nonprofit centers that offer sliding scales and scholarships. Nicole did a great job of really outlining the family-friendly business practices and employer-based supports, which are an incredible first step. Just alleviating that extra pressure on parents goes a long way in terms of supporting your employees. Next slide. We also have an education campaign that we have been running for about a year now called Larimer Thrive by 5. Hopefully some of you have seen our billboards around town. But this is really an effort to raise awareness about childcare access, the need for children to have that very stable environment in the first 5 years, so that we are creating our next generation of talented workers. And it's a great way for businesses or anyone in the community to promote this as an issue and to help us just garner additional education and support. And we also host a monthly advisory council as a nonprofit that is guided by the community. Our advisory council consists of a wide range of leaders in the community that inform or create our strategic plan and inform our work, and is also a great place to just stay abreast of what's going on in the early childhood sector and how to get involved. So if you're interested in those things, don't hesitate to reach out. Next slide. I don't really remember what the next slide is, honestly. Oh, there you go. So like I said, there's a lot to be done. We are in a phase of regrouping in terms of a local solution, but it is not going to go away as a priority, regardless of what comes down from universal pre-K, from Build Back Better. There will continue to be gaps in our community and access issues, and we intend to divine local solutions as we go forward.
Thank you, Christina and Nicole. We appreciate the rich information that you shared with our audience today. We did want to take a moment to open it up for any questions that anyone might have. Feel free to raise your hand and come off mute. And again, we've got Nicole and Christina here to be able to share some thoughts.
Yeah, and real quick, before we dive into any questions, I do want to say that this is not the last time that we hope to engage with our business community on this topic. We're hopeful to offer another similar session early in 2022. And then we at the council have the capacity and the ability to provide some one-on-one consultation with businesses that have an interest in increasing family-friendly practices, taking a deep dive look at your policies and culture in terms of making your organizations more family-friendly and kind of alleviating the pressure on your staff. And so please don't hesitate to reach out to that in that capacity as well. We're really hopeful to work with a couple employers in the next couple months to provide that kind of guidance. And so let us know if you're interested.
Fantastic. Well, let's give it a moment here to see if we do have any other questions. Looks like we've had some great action in the chat. Thank you, Julie, for sharing resources throughout. We'll certainly also share those out to those of you that have registered and attended with us today. Well, I'm not seeing any hands raised. So let me be the bearer of good tidings and give you all time, the gift of time back in your day. And again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Nicole. Tremendous insight, fantastic, easy to implement solutions, as well as setting a vision for a bigger solution for Northern Colorado. I definitely appreciate the time and the thoughtfulness that both of you have brought to this conversation. As mentioned at the very beginning, we can't bring our economy back to where it was without a viable childcare solution here in Northern Colorado. And I just really appreciate the leadership and the vision that Nicole and Christina both have brought to our community and to the conversation. So we'll continue to work together. I certainly hope that all of you will join us for the conversations in 2022. Keep an eye on the Chamber website as well as the Early Childhood Council website. And we look forward to seeing you at our next conversation. Go out, have a great day, and thanks again.
Thanks, Anne. Have a great day, everyone.